people asking me about cutting different angles aside from a 90-degree angle. So what I've done since is I've developed a newer saw guide that does 45 degrees, which is a typical, most common angle. Of course, you can modify it to create any other angle. So this is the actual saw guide for 45 degrees. Hi, I'm Norman Perillo, a furniture designer, maker at Perillo Design, and a woodworking educator, author at WoodSkills. If you recall in my last video, I had designed this saw guide. I call it a jig or saw guide to be able to cross-cut boards down to size using a Japanese handsaws, mostly a Ryoba or a Kataba, but I much prefer the Kataba, and I'll demonstrate why. But I gave examples of both using a Ryoba, which is a more versatile saw with two edges, both a rip and a crosscut. And what I've done since is I had people asking me about cutting different angles aside from a 90-degree angle. So what I've done since is I've developed a newer saw guide that does 45 degrees, which is a typical, most common angle. Of course, you can modify it to create any other angle. So this is the actual saw guide for 45 degrees. And also at the same time, I've also beefed this up. This was the original version of the saw guide for 90-degree crosscuts, and I've actually increased it in size I beefed it up. It's about maybe 3/8 of an inch taller, 1/4 inch deeper, and I think it's the same width. So this gives more of a bearing surface for the saw, as I described and demonstrated in the last video. So it provides more of a bearing surface. And again, I've also attached very thin strips of sandpaper to the inside, so that it works really well with the grip. If you're holding it by hand, you can clamp it, and often I prefer clamping it. It's very quick, but it frees up your hand so you can guide the saw a little better, and I'll demonstrate that too. So that's the original, and that's the newer version. It's taller and deeper, but they both function the same. And this is the 45-degree version. I'll give demonstrations of all this coming up. It works really well, very impressed. So I had to give some thought to how to do this correctly. It also has that strip of sandpaper in the back to be able to guide it along or brace it against this. So you can either hand hold it against a piece of wood. Here, this is a better example. You can either hand hold it against a piece of wood that you're cross-cutting at 45 degrees, or clamp it. So there is provision for clamping with clearance for the saw blade, of course, because you wouldn't want your saw blade to interfere with the part of the clamp. So it's very accurate and precise, and it provides a very solid 45-degree cut. And I'll give a demonstration of that coming up. So stay tuned. So I'm going to give a demonstration of the 45-degree crosscut saw guide. I can either hold it by hand or clamp it, and I prefer clamping, and I'll show you why. Okay, so that's set up, and I'll demonstrate why. So I'm using a Kataba, and I like the Kataba because it's not as deep, and I'll show you why. So I can guide the saw along the reference surface of the saw guide with 2 fingers to begin the cut, and you'll see what I'm doing. So I actually bring it down about an inch or so into the board, and then I've actually created enough of a curve, a thin curve, to be able to continue with the cut without actually holding it with my fingers. So I just guide it along here. Make sure that's tight. There's no danger of cutting slicing into your fingers or anything, because it's way above here, and the saw cut, or the teeth are actually in the board itself. So as long as you're above the board. And don't forget, it's a Japanese saw, it's a pull stroke. I can release it now and continue. And the kerf itself guides the saw really well, because it's a very thin kerf. It's a very narrow kerf because of the 0.6 millimeter saw blade. So I'll just release the guide. And we'll check that angle. Confirm that the angle, I got this, our protractor set to 45. So it's perfect at 45. Across its width. And it's a very, very fine, smooth cut, owing specifically to the fine tooth configuration of the Catawba, which is designed for cross-cutting in this version. It's almost better than off a table saw or any machine, because you don't have the circular saw marks. It's a beautiful cut, and it's 45, so I'm very, very impressed with this. So without having to use any machinery or power tools, you can create this sort of cut just using hand tools. The beauty of the actual jig itself is that it's wood, and it's easily replaceable. You can actually make 2 or 3 at a time, like I've done already, and it's wood. So what I'll do now is I'll recreate that same cut, that 45-degree cut. Again, I'll clamp it because I much prefer clamping, and I'll use a Ryoba this time, just to give you an example of how this would work with a Ryoba. So it's all set, and it's very easy to set up using a small clamp like this. So using the cross-cut teeth on a Ryoba. Now, you can still guide the saw, as I've already demonstrated, using this configuration. With the Ryoba, it's a deeper saw, so you, as long as you've got your hands up here, you're fine. So important to keep the saw against the reference edge, the bearing surface of the saw guide. I call it a saw guide now. Okay, we can continue now. Okay, release that. Check for, again, 45, using my protractor. Again, perfect 45. Not sure if you can see that, but it's perfect to 45 along the width of the board. And that's the important part. So it's 45 degrees, and it's deep, and it's just as smooth as, I think the Catawba is just slightly a little smoother, but it's incredibly smooth for a cut using a handsaw and not a machine. So that's an example of a nominal 1x3, which has been cut down to 3/4 by 2.5, a typical board you'd use in a frame or something. And that's how simple it is. So I'm using my face vise, and I'm using a sort of sliding board jack that I've developed to hold the other end up. But you could easily set it up on the workbench surface, and I forgot to mention this the last time, using holdfasts, and also saw it. I'm not going to give an example of that. But if you don't have a face vise, you can do it that way. This should be enough of a bearing surface. And what I'll do next is provide an example with a thicker board. So what I have now is a nominal 2x3, which is about 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and I'll give an example of that. So it has a square end at the moment, and I'll bring it down to 45 using the new 45 degrees saw guide. Definitely clamp this one in. Okay, so I'll use the Catawba again on this one, and to make sure the saw clears the clamp. And I use my fingers again to guide the saw initially. When working with these Japanese saws, again, it's a pull stroke and and work on tension when you're pulling, and not to put too much force because the actual weight of the saw plate itself is sufficient. And I keep rotating it a little bit. Okay, so we'll check that now. Very smooth. Perfect 45 across its width. Very fine, very smooth cut. So it is almost ready for, well, it is ready for joinery or putting it together without having to shoot the end, and that's what I like about it. I don't think I would have a much smoother end, even if it was had been done with a shooting board. So that's an example of a thicker board, 2x3. I cut down the size, so very, very, very impressive. What I can do next is give an example of if you don't have a face vise, of actually doing it with holdfasts. So I'll set that up. So I have an set up now. If you don't have a face vise and all you have is a few dog holes in your bench, you can actually just simply use holdfasts, and I'll give an example of that. So I'm using two very inexpensive holdfasts, and I'll just set them up so this board is not going to move, and then we use the saw guide at this end again with the clamp. I'm trying to create small cuts because I'm trying to get as much yield as possible out of this board for these demonstrations. So that's 45, so we'll create another cut. I'll use a kataba this time again, and I'll guide the saw, but this is using holdfasts. Again, using my finger to keep the saw plate or saw blade against the bearing surface of the saw guide. Not necessary, but it helps. Okay, good. So release this and release the holdfast. And we'll check this again for angle. It's very, very fine. Get that protractor out. Oops. Perfect at 45, right across its width. Perfect at 45, right across its width. So that's just using holdfasts. And the reason I demonstrated this because I was asked, if you don't have a face vise, what can you do? So you can do this several ways of holding your work, and this is probably the most basic of all, is using holdfasts. It doesn't get simpler than that. If you have any other vise, you can use that also. That'll be it. So very, very impressed with this guide. And I'm not going to give a demonstration of the new and improved 90-degree crosscut guide, but it works actually just as well. It has a wider, deeper bearing surface. It's a reference surface for the saw blade, so that's improved. So if I had to recreate these, I would create this size. I don't have a ruler here. So the dimensions, the earlier version dimensions were 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. And this newer one is still 1.5 inches wide. It's 1 inch in all three of the jigs, or saw guides I should say, are all rabbited together and then reinforced with some dowels, all three of them. ones I've created. I could create more, but and that's the beauty of using making your own and using wood, is that you can replace them just as easily. So ensure that the faces are in the same plane, both the vertical and the horizontal surface, and the one length is shorter than the other, and this is for edges, and this would be for faces. The same with this one. I kept those measurements the same, or maybe longer. Actually, they're slightly longer. This one's a newer version is slightly longer again. The 45-degree version is essentially the same as the newer version, along with this extra component element to create that 45-degree angle. Now you can easily substitute this with a different board to create 30-degree angles, or even 60-degree angles, or whatever you desire. Put a little thought into that, and it's glued and on both surfaces, and it works really well, along with that sandpaper to hold it in place, hold everything in place. So in conclusion, I'm very happy with the saw guides. And this, again, it's the original version. This is the newer upgraded version, which is deeper, taller, and some of the edges are a little longer too. I'm very happy with this one now. So this would be my go-to for cross-cutting at 90 degrees using Japanese hand saws, the Kataba and the Ryoba. And this is the newer, as I've demonstrated, the newer 45-degree version. So this is essentially the same saw guide as the newer version, with the same depth and width, along with this extra element, this extra component that delivers that angle of 45, a perfect 45, and that's important to get it right first time, because you are using this as a bearing surface and a reference surface at that angle. So you can actually modify this and and substitute a different angle of 30, 60, or any common angle that you're working with, but I typically work with 90 or 45 degrees in my work. So they work really well. And again, you can use the more versatile Ryoba with two edges, and I use a crosscut edge for this one, or the Kataba. So I much prefer the Kataba because it has that, the saw blade or saw plate isn't as deep, so I can guide it with my fingers. This particular model at 265 millimeters has slightly finer teeth than that Ryoba. The Ryoba is a more versatile saw. This is more dedicated crosscut saw, so it has more teeth and a higher PPI, or teeth per inch, and they're probably finely set. And the saw plate itself is a little thicker at 0.6 millimeters compared to 0.5, so that helps too in the stability and the rigidity of the saw blade or saw plate. So if anything, I would invest in a good Kataba. You could use a Ryoba, of course, no problem. It's only, most Ryobas are 0.5 millimeter saw plates. Saw plates or saw blades are fairly standard at that thickness, and whereas the Katabas are 0.6 because they're more dedicated for crosscuts. The important thing is not to get a saw with a spine or a back saw, a Dozuki, for example, because you're limiting yourself in the depth of cut. Dozukis are more oriented towards fine joinery cuts, like dovetail joints. And the only other thing you need is, aside from a little bit of wood and some reinforcing dowels, is this very inexpensive $4, $5 clamp you can purchase anywhere at a woodworking supply store. Make sure you get a light one but strong, so you don't distort the wood. And if you don't have a face vise, of course, you can use holdfasts to hold your wood. So it doesn't get simpler than this to create crosscuts at both 45 or 90 that I use typically in my my joinery. This is an example of a mitered bridle joint. So I would use this in this type of joinery for bringing it down to size, the components. And so hopefully you gained some insight into how to use hand saws to create fine, precise saw cuts just using a hand saw, and you can apply it in your own work without resorting to a table saw. Machines are inherently dangerous if you're not sure what you're doing. So this is a safer alternative. It's quiet, and it's really essentially dust free. So if you're in an environment where you can't create noise, this is ideal. set them up and try them on your own. And I'm hoping you have as much success with all this as I have, and go forward with your woodworking. So please subscribe to my YouTube woodworking channel, where I share more of my woodworking techniques, my woodworking philosophy, my thoughts on woodworking, and all the challenges I've experienced, and I introduce some of the new forms of woodworking I've discovered. And also visit woodskills.com, where I have a good selection of my books, both in print and digital format, on woodworking, and all my online courses, and I also offer some woodworking plans. I have maintained a regular blog on what I've got going on in my workshop and in woodworking in general. So enjoy.